from your session. So I might initially go to the first room, the economics of early learning and care. Maybe either Daniela or Olga, if you could just give us just a bit of a couple of minute overview about what emerged from your group.
Thanks, Jay. I'll kick off. Olga, definitely feel free to jump in, but Olga's from the OECD and does all the work on international comparisons in this area. So we got a sort of a fascinating overview from her, including the confirmation, if we needed it, that we have very high out-of-pocket childcare costs in Australia by international standards, and they account for, I think it was 20% of household disposable income for the median family, which is a pretty shocking cost of living figure, and that alongside that we have really high rates of part-time work for women because of the disincentives that those out-of-pocket costs create. So we had a bit of a discussion around that old perennial topic. There was certainly some frustration in the room of how difficult it is to get buy-in, to talk about this as an economic issue and a participation issue. The fact that the coverage seems to kind of default back to this idea of how much are high-income women going to get back if you change the policy, and why are you giving $20,000 to women earning over $200,000 a year, or whatever it is. The kind of the first article off the bat is always about that. It is much harder to get to that kind of grand economic narrative. So we talked a little bit how you can kind of come up with some cut-through economic arguments. We also got a bit into the issue of early educator pay, which I know technically wasn't on our list, but we had some people that were keen to go there. I think there was a recognition of the work being done inside the union movement, but it's not being picked up so much by groups outside of unions. And with that issue, and more broadly, just the challenges of trying to do policy in this space, where you have a mix of profits and not-for-profits and sort of council providers. It's just harder to come in and affect change than a world where you've got a fully public system. So I think that is one of the challenges that we always come up against. So that was the 2-minute version.
Right. Thank you, Danny. I know it's a lot to ask, summarising a 3/4 of an hour discussion in a couple of minutes, but thank you for doing that. The second one was the Women in Workforce Participation discussion group. And Mary and Susan, did one of you want to just summarise what emerged from that group?
Thanks, Jay. I'll give it a good shot, but we were just getting on such a roll there that we need to move to the virtual Chardonnay room just to finish it off, I think. But we were discussing firstly the long-term effects of women who don't return to the workforce whilst raising their children, but challenging ourselves to see it from a system level. And I obviously see through HESTA the magnification of what discriminatory practices in the workforce look like in retirement. And our chance in this country to not then ask women to fix it themselves is really apparent, and we need to be able to see that from the system level. And we had the good pleasure of having Susan Metcalf, who's from Chief Executive Women, who has at her hands and somehow buried in the recesses of her mind every data set that's ever available about workforce participation. So if you need to know anything, that is your oracle. Talking about, talking about just what's happened over the last year. I mean, we see an unprecedented opportunity to invest in social services in this country, but we've also seen an unprecedented use of the word unprecedented, and so I'll just do it one more time. We've also seen an unprecedented amount of men who have been able to rise through the workforce in the way in which we haven't seen before. We think because, of a need to go back to some sort of old-fashioned view of what it is to look like a good provider, a good man, a good CEO. This is what they look like. The manifestation of that in home and working life, and as I said, just getting on a roll, really haven't solved anything, generally getting fairly angry, going to go home now and blame someone else for it. But I think it's worthwhile to continue the discussion about that double dividend of early education. It really is a workforce participation tool as much as it is one to increase our children's learning. And the more that we can see that in this country, the more we'll be able to prove that everyone wins by somebody winning. And I think that's a great discussion to take forward.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. I think it's a really powerful point about, I mean, the system tries to do two things, but if we get it right for children, we can also potentially get it right for families as well. Room 3, Craig and Lucy, who wants to have a go at summarising what you came up with? Craig or Lucy? I think Lucy's trying to talk, but she's muted. There we go. It won't let you unmute. Somebody needs to unmute Lucy, maybe, or no? We'll try and.
Should I go?
Okay, Craig, you go.
I'll go.
No, Lucy's,
Oh, you're on.
Lucy's,
You're on.
No,
Lucy.
no, I was
good.
saying Craig should go. He led the conversation.
Okay.
Well, Lucy came up with what I think is an excellent idea. And that is, we know that the Department of Finance in Canberra, its real role is to limit government spending. You know, their sort of KPI is we saved the budget a fair bit of money this year. And individual officers are in the same category. So when it comes to properly remunerating early childhood educators and, you know, childcare, people who've got Certificate 3, their incentives are to say no, to suppress that. But if you took the same approach as that same department takes to infrastructure, it would it would look at a business case for infrastructure development. Say, okay, well, that'll save on, you know, travel times, increase productivity, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we can see merit in a particular transport upgrade. If you did that on child care and early childhood education, to get the sort of benefits that we're talking about, increased participation, increased productivity, you know, having talented women back in the workforce earlier if they so wished, it would be much, much more powerful. And I wouldn't be asking the finance department to do it because they'll say there is no case, but they should be commissioning independent analysis, and we should be submitting that and say, here is the business case for it. There was also finally frustration that we have had these sorts of conversations for 20 plus, maybe 30 years, and there's a bit of a kind of sense, are we getting anywhere? But ever the optimist, I said, yes, we are. Look at this conference and look at everyone speaking up to change attitudes towards childcare and early childhood education.
Thanks, Craig. Lucy, go.
Yeah. So I think I totally agree with what Craig says. So what we're really doing is we're encouraging an investment case for investing in early childhood learning. And I think it's the sort of thing which should actually would be entirely consistent with every single intergenerational report I've ever read, which is all about driving productivity, participation, and population. We are facing a fertility decline and an immigration decline. So unless we jump on this quickly, our productivity, just in terms of intergenerational reporting, will be massively impaired unless we make investments in this kind of thing right now.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, very powerful point. And I think that goes in some ways to answering the question, why now? Why is this going to be successful now? Because some of the imperatives are actually looming much larger. The fourth room was the early years executive functions and lifelong wellbeing. I love this phrase, executive functions. I mean, I think it's really powerful that in the first 5 years, you lay down the sort of functions you're going to use in some of the highest level of what we imagine as the workforce. So Ryan or Georgie, do you want to take us through what you came up with?
Yeah, sure. We had a great conversation that talked a little bit about how we see and experience kids learning in real life. Like we, as parents and as educators, we see how kids learn and develop. And so thinking through how we take that knowledge that we have from our lived experience and thinking about how it applies in institutional formal settings, but then also to government policy, is really critical. One of the things that I think was a really valuable contribution from some educators and some researchers was about looking at the importance that we see children's attachment playing in their ability to learn and thrive. And so this concept of building security for the children with the people that they are spending their time with, the educators they're spending their time with, but also the importance of security for those educators themselves, and having workplace and environments that are strong for them and nourish them as well as nourishing the children, I think is important. The other interesting point that was raised was, how do we bridge really the expert knowledge gap between what scientists know, leading policy thinkers know about the importance of the early years for brain development and executive function development, and communicating that and its importance to the general population, to both parents but also non-parents, who to understand just how much children do learn and need high quality environments in those early years. And we talked a little bit, and Georgie had some really good comments about how we sort of try to bridge that gap and expand the sharing of knowledge about the importance of these years for our children. And she also mentioned, which I think we should all look out for, is some new research that the Parenthood's got coming out, I think Monday next week, that's going to touch on some of these questions. So I'm excited to see that next week, and I hope you all are too. And that was the details of our conversation.
Beautiful. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Georgie, for that. And look, thanks everybody for participating in these conversations. And I suppose in some ways too, as we wrap this up, to answer in a sense the implicit question that arose earlier about why, when a lot of us have been talking about this for a long period of time, why is this going to be successful? I can remember raising this at COAG meetings, and everybody says, yeah, this is fantastic, let's do something about it. And then some other important thing comes along, and then it drops off the agenda. So why now? Why we're going to be successful? It's partly Lucy's point. I think the objective circumstances mean that this issue is now front and centre in terms of public policy. We need to extract more out of our existing workforce. We also, I think, know that we're going to be dealing with this sort of relatively lockdown environment where we're not going to be able to dine out on population growth in terms of driving our economic story in the future. So, and I think there's a growing awareness that the real productivity agenda is, not the bridge between sort of one side of a road and another, but actually between the neurons inside a child's brain. That's the real infrastructure that we should be building, because so much of the jobs of the future actually depend on those executive functions. So all of the process jobs, technology is just ripping out of the economy at a rapid rate. What's left are the jobs that rely upon those high order functions, the very functions that are laid down in the first 5 years of life. So if you actually want to prepare your citizens for that shrinking billabong of jobs that exist in the present economy, then you just leave things the way they are. If you want to prepare them for the future, you ensure that those first 5 years enable them to thrive. And I suppose to a large degree, that's why we're trying to pursue this campaign. And interestingly, when we've done the research on the narratives that actually shift public opinion, we know that there is about 2/3 of people support this idea of a high quality, universally accessible early learning system. It's quite strong. What's interesting about it is that it doesn't vary greatly between men and women, young and old, or progressive or conservative. I mean, it differs in the ways you might imagine, but it's not a very large difference. It's up to as high as 75% amongst the people directly affected, young families. It never drops far below 50%. And the people against it are never very much more than 10 or 15%. And there's a significant group in the middle that just don't know. So we're pushing against an open door with this argument. And the arguments work best. There are 3 narratives that grip. One is the brain story about how children's brains develop and what that means for their future learning and well-being trajectory. The other is about the cost of living pressures for young families. And the third is the workforce discrimination point against women. And each of those arguments strongly supported, and together they're even more powerful. So separately they're strong, but together they're even more powerful. So to the extent that some people say, well, it might be good for the economy, but it's not good for kids, that's why you need that other dimension of the argument that sits alongside those arguments. So we think this is a winning campaign. As a lot of people on this call will be familiar enough with politics to know that not every great argument necessarily translates into policy. But sometimes there's a tipping point where you crystallise a high quality argument and then it turns into action. And I think we're on the cusp of doing that. We're heading off next week to Canberra for 2 weeks in Canberra, the centrepiece of which is a National Press Club speech, which will be given by Nicola Forrest and myself. And the idea is to try and punch through and crack open this and put this on the national public policy agenda. It's going to be followed up by a symposium the week later. It's being sort of, in a sense, teed up by Georgie Dent's work with the Parenthood, a report that's going out Monday. And at the end of it, we have a commitment from us, the Senate Committee on Employment and Education, to actually run an inquiry on this topic. So we've got a nice series of events which we hope will build momentum as we move into the lead up to the federal budget, where we hope there will at least be some response in relation to this question. So one of the things we're doing when we go to Canberra, though, is taking stories. We're taking stories of everyday Australians who are actually wanting to essentially put their voices ahead of Parliament. So we've actually invited those stories, and if you go to our website, thriveby5.org.au, what you'll see there is an opportunity to share your story, a number of which have emerged today. So we'd really encourage you to take advantage of that by clicking Get Involved, Share Our Story. And we're gathering all those up and we're presenting hundreds of stories to politicians. We're giving them in both a virtual and also a hard copy form. And they're just the voices of everyday Australians who are talking about educators, parents, talking about their experiences with this system. So we really encourage you to join this campaign, use your networks to join the campaign. Nothing actually concentrates the mind in politicians, especially in a year we expect to be an election year, more than pressure from the people that elect them. And so it's critically important that we increase the number of supporters so that we can get a critical mass in some of the seats that they're worried about winning in the next election. So please go to the campaign website, thriveby5.org.au, and sign up. Get your mates to sign up, and we really look forward to campaigning with you on what I think we all accept is probably one of the great social economic reforms that really completes the social insurance project for our country. So thank you so much for being here today. It's just been a thrill to get so many really high quality contributors, and I'd like to thank you for participating, and look forward to seeing you all on the campaign trail.
Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks,
Thank
great.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jay.
Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.